Good morning and welcome back to day 2 of making the storage bench. I set the fence for 11 1/4. Both the back panels and the side panels are 11 1/4 wide. So we'll rip one piece right now. Now we'll cut them the length. I have to make 3 cuts, one at 45 3/4 and the other 2 are at 15 1/2. Now we need 4 side rails. So what I'll do is I'll take a piece that's 5 1/2 inches wide, 1x6, cut 2 pieces at 14 3/4, and then we'll rip them down on the table saw so we can get 2 pieces out of each. Now we'll head over to the table saw and rip them down to 2 inches each. Four more pieces, all cut to size. The next thing I'm gonna make are 4 side cleats, part P in the materials list. They're 14 3/4 inches long by 1.5 inches each. This is a good time to use that split piece of wood. When I cut those pieces to 14 3/4 inches long, those splits fell right off. This is what I'm left with. I'm gonna rip these down into my 1.5 inch pieces. Well, that worked out quite well. We got rid of the splits, very little waste, and don't forget, we gotta mark those. Part P. Now we're gonna move on to some plywood. In the plan, it calls for MDF, medium density fiberboard. However, we're gonna use 3/4 inch birch plywood. This next piece I have to cut is that 8-foot tall piece of 3/4 inch birch plywood behind me. Now, in the spirit of social distancing during this coronavirus, I'm a one-man show. I'm gonna have to do this one alone. Don't try this at home. This isn't something that I have you guys do by yourselves here, but like I said, it's just me. So take a look at how I do it safely. Like I said, I wouldn't advise you guys to do this, but after almost 30 years of woodworking, you can make it happen. Now I've got my panel for the bottom cut to width. Now I gotta cut it to length. I could take it over to our radial amp saw, but I wanna show you a new tool that we have in the shop. This is called a panel saw. You may have seen it at a Lowe's or a Home Depot, and let me show you how it works. So what we do is we take the panel that we're trying to cut, and we put it down here on the rollers. You'll notice I already put a line on the board. I measured over the 43 inches that it said to. I'm gonna put this onto the rollers. I'm gonna bring the line over until it's about in the middle of this. Then I can bring the saw down, and there's 2 ways you can do this. You can look over the top of the saw and line it up that way, but sometimes your board is really tall and you can't do it that way. So what you wanna do in that case is pull off the vacuum hose and look through that hole where the vacuum goes, and you can bring it down and you can really get it accurate. There's our bottom panel. So what we've just done is we created the bottom panel for our bench. And that bottom panel was 15 3/4 inches wide by 43 inches long. Now we're gonna use the leftover piece to make our dividers. If you look at the dividers, it says they're 12 3/4 inches wide by 15 3/4. Now, we're using plywood, and it doesn't really matter the orientation of the grain in plywood. So I already have the 15 3/4 inch length because we ripped it to 15 3/4 for the bottom panel. Now all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut 2 more pieces at 12 3/4 on the radial amp saw. These pieces won't be seen, or they'll be painted over. So the orientation of the grain in this case really doesn't matter. Let me cut those now, and then we'll continue with some other things in a minute. I've come back to the radial amp saw to make these 2 cuts. I'm using a stop block so they can come out perfectly. This radial amp saw will accommodate a board up to 21 inches wide. So we could have done that first cut over here, but I wanted to show you the panel saw. Let me make those cuts now. Perfect. Now we're gonna create the divider edging. Just 2 pieces, a 1/2 inch thick, 3/4 of an inch wide, and 10.5 inches long. I still have a scrap piece left over from earlier. You wanna always check the end before you cut or mark, all right? This end has been the one that we already cut before. If you look at the other end, you can tell it's a little bit rougher, never been cut before. So I'm just gonna measure from this end, and we'll use this portion. There's my mark right there. Spot on. Okay, let's rip 2 pieces to 3/4, then we'll plane them down to a 1/2 inch. Let's head back to the planer. All right, remember when we're running through the planer, we're gonna take about a 1/16 inch off each time. It'll probably take 4 passes to get us down to a 1/2 inch. I'll check after 3. Yep, just as I thought, we're gonna need 1 more pass. Now, I know not everyone has one of these fancy gadgets. We can check it with that just quickly. That's perfect. However, if you don't have one of those fancy gadgets, which most people do not, we can just use a tape measure. However, I suggest that you don't hook the tape measure on the edge of the board. The end of the tape measure may have fallen on the ground, may be bent a little bit, and it may be inaccurate. So what I would suggest you do is to measure from one of the 1 inch marks. So let's just take a look at that. If I just put it on any of them, let's put it on the 3 inch mark, it should be perfectly 1/2 inch, just like that. And that is the tip of the day. Using some of the scrap wood we have left over from the previous cuts, even from one of those split pieces that we had earlier, I'm gonna make up the spacers. The spacers are 1/4 inch thick and a 1/2 inch wide, and they're fairly short. So right now we're gonna rip them to a 1/2 inch wide, and then we're gonna plane them to a 1/4 inch thick, and then we'll look and see how we're gonna do the lengths. Okay, we've got our 1/2 inch wide pieces. Now we have to run them through the planer till they're a 1/4 inch thick. I finished planing those spacer pieces down, but on my final pass, I wanted to make sure that those spacer pieces were the same thickness as our back slats. So all I did was I take the back slat, I put it on the table, I put it next to the piece, and I make sure that there's no difference in thickness. And I just crept up to it. So my final 2 passes were only a 1/4 of a turn. Now that we have these down to size, we need to cut them to length. You'll notice on one of the scrap pieces on the back side here, this portion of it here didn't actually get planed. It was a little bit too thin down that end, so I won't use that end, but I will use this end if I need it. I think I've got enough to make these spacers. Now I looked at the plan, and if you take a look at the plan, it doesn't show you the length of what these spacers need to be, but there's enough information in the plan to figure it out. So what I did is I went into the plan and I looked at this page, and I know how many slats I have. I have 11 slats that are 2 inches wide, so that's 22 inches. I know the full length of this piece is 42 inches, so I subtract the 22 inches from the 42 inches, and that gives me 20 inches of space that I have to fill with these spacers. Now, I divided that up, and it was fairly uneven. It would have had to have been like 47 64ths or something like that. And so what I did is most of the spacers I'm going to create at 1 5/8. And so then I added the 9 center spacers, the ones in the middle, not the 2 end ones. I added the 1 5/8, multiplied it by 9, and got that dimension, and then figured out what was left. And I just divided that by 2. So the 2 end ones are just gonna be slightly bigger, almost unnoticeable. And I won't cut those until we actually have the assembly started. So let's head over to the radial arm saw, and I'll show you how to cut a really tiny piece. Okay, we're about to make those small little filler pieces. And in order to cut these on the radial arm saw, it's gonna require some close work. So what I've done is I've created just a little hold down stick so I can hold those little pieces from blowing away, because just the wind from the radial arm saw can lift the piece and ruin it. okay? And I want to keep my hands as far away as I can. This little piece of sandpaper that I've added to the end of the board will also help me pull that little piece away and stay in contact with it. So take a look at this. Then the final thing we have to do is to glue up the seat. Okay, so for the final segments of today's show, we're gonna finish up with the bench seat. Okay, our bench seat is going to be made out of 3/4 inch thick oak, which is actually what they call for in the plan too. So you're gonna learn a lot of stuff on gluing up panels during these next 5 or 10 minutes. The first thing I want to talk about is gluing up panels out of narrower pieces. If you use a wide piece of wood, you can go over to the wood shelf and you'll see in just a minute that I have a piece picked out that's a little over 6 inches wide. Now, the bench sheet is 17.5 inches wide when it's finished, and we got to glue up some of these pieces to add up to that. We could glue up 3 6-inch pieces and get an 18-inch wide piece. However, the wider the piece, the more chance that that piece will cup over time. A wide piece can cup over this distance. A narrow piece can only cup over this distance, so you're not going to get much of a cup, if any, if you glue up your pieces, your wide panels out of multiple narrow pieces. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take these pieces, we're going to cut 6 of them, just a little over 3 inches, so we have a little bit more width to start with, and then after we're done gluing it up, we can cut it down the size later. So take a look. I've got a stop block set up, and I'll cut all those pieces to length. Of course, the final length is 47.5. Whenever you're gluing something up, you want to make it a little bit longer so you don't have to worry about the ends being aligned perfectly. You'll never get them lined up perfectly during a glue up, and we'll cut those down later. So we're going to cut it to about 48 1/8 inches. Okay, so take a look right now. I've got my stop block set up on this end this time. There's no chance for any kickback or the board lifting really. And you'll notice I'm only going to come out just far enough to cut through it, and then I'll go back. So that also helps. I'll cut 1 or 2 more boards so we have enough wood, and then we'll head over to the table saw and rip them down to just over 3 inches. One final side note when cutting these pieces to length, because they're oversized, I do still check the end of the board, but if there's no crack, I don't worry about squaring it up perfectly right now. So I save a little time that way, and we're gonna square it up later anyway, but you do wanna look for cracks or splits and get rid of those first, because you probably won't be taking enough off the end of your panel to get rid of those later. Just a little tip. Okay, we'll get those ripped down to 3 3/16, and remember, put the smooth side towards the fence. Okay, not only are those pieces 3 3/16 inches wide, they're also parallel now. Now we're gonna lay them out, see what looks good, and I'll show you how to join them. Okay, so I've started the layout process. I've laid all the boards down here on the table. I took a look at the grain on each piece. One of them had a little bit of a knot or a bad spot. I flipped that over so that would be on the bottom. And I also checked the end of each board. I want to make sure that the ends alternate. So when you look at the end of the board, you can tell what the outside of the tree is and what the inside of the tree is by looking at the rings on the end of the board. So what I like to do is have the outside on the first one, and then the inside of the tree would be facing up on the second one, and alternate that all the way across. And that tends to help the board stay flat over time. Next up, we're gonna mark the boards so we can joint them. And I'll show you why we do that in just a minute. So when we mark them, let me zoom in on this for you. What I like to do is, first of all, if I like the way it looks, I put lettering, A, B, C, D, E, so that I can keep track of what board goes with which. Some people like to use a triangle method, where they put a triangle on their board. I just find that this lettering system works just fine. After that, I put an X on the top edge of one of the boards, and then on the back edge of the board it's being connected to. So that when I get over to the joiner, I know what edge needs to go what direction. And I'll explain that over at the joiner. So when we're using the joiner, we expect that the fence will be exactly 90 degrees to the table. Now that may not always be true, and in a lot of cases it probably isn't. So in a perfect world, if this was 90 degrees to the table every single time, we wouldn't even have to worry about this system that I'm putting in place right now with the A's and the B's and the C's and the X's. But because it's not a perfect world, I don't want to have to worry about this being perfect every single time. So we do it this way and guarantee every panel to be flat. So here's my sample right here. What I've done is I created the same thing that I just did on that other board. I have an A and an A, these two go together. I put the X on top and an X on the back side. Now, in every single case, when you use the joiner, just make sure you orient the X when you're joining that edge in the same direction every single time. What I like to do is say, make sure the X is towards the fence as you cut, and then the same thing on the second cut, okay? If you do that every single time, you should be okay. Now, if I put this X against the fence, here's the X, I put it against the fence, and I over-exaggerated the angle. So the fence wasn't square. So that X went that way, same thing on this one. The X and the X, they both went against the fence, and they both created the same angle, okay? However, because we kept track of that, when we put them together, they cancel each other out, and the panel continues to stay flat. If we didn't keep track of that, and we glued it up willy-nilly, this is an exaggeration, but your board could end up looking like this, in probably a little bit more subtle manner. So by doing it this way, you're guaranteed a perfect panel. Okay, so I'm gonna joint these pieces now. The first piece is only gonna need to be jointed on one edge because it's not getting connected on the other side. All the middle pieces need both edges jointed. Here we go. One thing that I do when I'm joining is I listen. If you don't hear the board being touched the whole way, you're gonna have to run it again. All right, here we are up at the glue bench. I've got 3 pipe clamps out. The reason why they call them pipe clamps is because they're made out of water pipes, and they have these attachments put on each end of them, okay? And the way they work is simple. They have flat spots on each end, so it sits flat on the table. I like to have the handles stick out a little bit so you can access them without knocking your knuckles. And then this back portion of the clamp, you have to pinch to drag it forward, okay? At least to drag it back. You can actually get away with pulling it forward oftentimes without having to pinch it. But if you need to open it up a little, you pinch it and you drag it back. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult. Okay, now that we have these jointed, these are very, very tight to one another, which is fantastic. I didn't show you before I jointed them very well, but the pieces had spaces in between them. And by joining them, that makes them straight so that we can put them together nice and tight. So all I do now is I separate them a little, I stand them up, not the last one because that's not getting glued to anything, and I take my Titebond 2, that's what I'm using, and we put a line of glue down the middle of each. I only glue one edge when I'm edge gluing. That's all that's necessary. Then what I like to do, pick one piece up at a time, I hook my hand over the top, and I spread that glue really quickly and evenly without losing any. My shop teacher in college said, any glue that spills out onto the ground isn't gonna help you join at all. What you wanna make sure is that you get the whole edge covered. Leave no dry spots. And if you can see the grain through the glue, that tells you that you have just the right amount of glue on. If it's covered and you can see the grain, then you've got enough but not too much. If you can't see the grain, then you're probably putting too much glue on. Okay, let's put it together. I try to line the ends up as close as I can. I'm not gonna worry about it too much. Remember, I left a little extra length. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start down this end, pull this clamp tight, line the ends up as much as I can, push them down tight to the clamp, and just put a little bit of pressure on it. Now I'm gonna put one on the top. The pressure should come from both directions. If you just put all the clamps on the bottom, it's gonna tend to put the pressure and be like this. So we're gonna put some clamps on top and even out that pressure. As I do it, I look to see that they're all nice and flat. Now we'll do the next one on the bottom. If you have an unevenness, you can come down the end, pull up on it a little bit. You're not worried about this end yet. You're only worried about where you're clamping. You try to make them as even as you can so that sanding later on will be minimal. Again, I'm using the end of the board to raise and lower. I use my fingers to feel the evenness, and then one last one at the end, and that is a panel all glued up. Now, you could take a wet rag right now and wipe off some of the glue. I don't typically like to do that. I like to wait about an hour. I'll take the clamps off and I'll scrape the glue off. One way you can tell if your glue up is perfect is you should see small amounts of glue coming out the back, little beads of glue. If you don't, like in this area, that joint might be starved just a little bit. I'm not worried about it.